The colony of Terran lay under a wide sky filled with pale clouds and distant stars. The settlers had worked hard for many years to build their homes on this new world. Their houses stood close together for safety, made of stone and metal gathered from the mountains. The people planted fields of grain and fruit, and they raised animals in simple wooden pens. Life was not easy, but they believed the planet would give them a future if they worked together. For a time, peace lived with them. Then came the dragons. The albino dragons were unlike anything the people had seen before. Their wings stretched longer than the roofs of 3 houses. Their scales were pale white, shining faintly under the sun, and their eyes glowed with a silver fire. They came from the high peaks beyond the valley, and whenever they flew, the air trembled with the beat of their wings. The first time one appeared, the villagers froze. It circled above the fields, casting a shadow that moved slowly across the land. The animals cried out in panic, and the children screamed as their parents rushed to pull them inside. Everyone hid, peering through cracks in windows, hearts pounding as the great beast drifted lower. The dragon did not attack. It landed by the river, drank from the water, then leapt back into the sky and vanished beyond the mountains. Still, fear grew. The people had heard stories of beasts on alien worlds, but nothing had prepared them for this. Soon there were more. Dragons began to appear in pairs, sometimes in groups. They flew low over the farmland, their shadows stretching across the golden fields. They never spoke, never roared words of threat. But the settlers felt the power in their presence. Some said the creatures were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Others whispered that they were guardians of the land who did not want humans here. Fear ruled the nights. Families kept their children inside. Work in the fields slowed, for people were too afraid to tend the crops when the sky might darken with wings at any moment. Among these settlers was a little girl named Mira. She lived with her parents in a small stone house near the edge of the village. Mira was small, with dark hair tied in simple braids, and her laughter often carried across the streets. She was different from the others. Where they saw only terror, she saw wonder. Mira liked to sit outside, looking up at the sky for hours. She would watch the dragons glide high above, their wings flashing in the sunlight. When others hid, she leaned forward in awe. She did not understand why the grown-ups shook with fear. To her, the dragons were not monsters. They were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Her mother often pulled her inside, scolding her for standing out in the open. But Mira could not help herself. She dreamed of touching their pale scales, of running her hands along wings that could block out the sun. She imagined what it might feel like to ride on their backs and soar across the valleys. The colony leaders met often in the council hall. They argued over what should be done. Some said they must build weapons, traps, or fire machines to drive the dragons away. Others wanted to leave the outer fields and retreat closer to the mountains, abandoning their hard work. A few elders believed the dragons would go away on their own if they did not disturb them. But no one dared to approach the creatures. One evening, the sound of wings filled the air. The villagers scattered in panic, dragging their children indoors. Doors slammed, shutters closed, and the streets emptied in silence. Mira's father called for her, but when he turned, she was not there. Mira had slipped away, her small feet carrying her to the fields. She stood on the open ground, looking up as the dragon descended. Its wings beat like thunder, shaking the earth, and its shadow covered her completely. The villagers watched from behind their windows, horrified. The albino dragon landed with a heavy thud, its claws sinking into the soil. Its long neck curved down, and its silver eyes fixed on the tiny girl below. The creature's breath steamed in the cool air, a cloud of frost drifting over the grass. Mira did not scream. She did not run. She lifted her hand as if greeting an old friend. The dragon tilted its head, studying her. The people watching expected it to strike, to sweep her away in a flash of wings or teeth. But the beast did nothing. It lowered its massive head closer, until its glowing eyes were level with hers. Mira giggled softly and whispered, asking if it wanted to play. A long moment passed, filled only with the sound of the river nearby. Then, to everyone's shock, the dragon blinked slowly, a gesture almost gentle. It turned its head, spread its wings, and rose back into the sky. leaving Mira standing unharmed. When her father rushed to pull her back inside, the villagers could not stop talking. Some said she was lucky to be alive. Others whispered that the dragon had chosen her, though no one knew what that meant. Fear remained, but now it was mixed with confusion. Mira, however, felt only excitement. She had looked into the eyes of the albino dragon and seen no anger, no hunger. She had seen curiosity, almost as if the creature was waiting to understand her. That night, as the village huddled together in whispered worry, Mira sat awake at her window. She gazed at the peaks where the dragons lived, her heart filled not with fear, but with hope. She believed the dragons were not enemies. She believed they could be friends. The silent sky of Terran stretched above her, filled with stars and mysteries, and Mira made a small promise to herself. She would not run from the dragons. She would meet them again, not as a warrior, not as prey, but as a friend who wanted nothing more than to play beneath the wide, endless sky. The village of Taran did not rest after the strange meeting between Mira and the albino dragon. For many nights the people spoke in low voices about what had happened. Some believed the dragon had spared her by chance. Others believed it had tested her and would one day return to finish what it started. Yet there was one truth everyone agreed upon. Mira was no longer an ordinary child in their eyes. The council gathered again in the stone hall at the center of the colony. Men and women sat in a circle, their faces tense, voices sharp. They spoke of defenses, of weapons, of hiding places for the children. They argued about how long they could survive if the dragons decided to attack. One elder, his hair white as snow, raised his voice above the others. He said that humans had always survived by being cautious. They must not let a child's strange luck blind them. The dragons were dangerous and no one should risk standing near them again. As they argued, Mira sat outside on the steps of the hall. She swung her feet back and forth, listening to the muffled voices inside. Her father stood nearby, his arms folded. He was worried, yet he did not scold her as he had before. Deep in his heart, he was proud of her courage, but fear still held him silent. The next morning, life in the village returned to its uneasy rhythm. Farmers went out to the fields, glancing often at the sky. Mothers called their children back inside whenever a shadow passed. Hunters moved into the forest with quiet steps, careful not to make noise that might carry into the mountains. Mira, however, could not forget the dragon's eyes. She thought of them every moment. When she helped her mother grind grain, when she carried water from the river, when she lay awake at night, she remembered the silver glow and the gentle blink. It was as if the dragon had spoken without words, telling her that it wanted to understand her as much as she wanted to understand it. One evening, the sky darkened with wings again. This time 2 dragons came. The villagers panicked, running to their homes. Shutters banged closed, doors slammed, and the streets emptied in moments. Mira's father caught her hand, but she slipped free. She ran down the path toward the fields, her small feet carrying her faster than his. The dragons circled overhead, their cries echoing like distant horns. The ground shook as one of them descended, landing near the same place where Mira had met the first dragon. The other circled above, watching. Mira stood in the open, raising her arms toward the sky. She called out with a laugh, as though greeting an old friend. The nearest dragon lowered its head, eyes narrowing in interest. The other villagers, peering from their windows, held their breath. Mira knelt and picked up a smooth stone from the ground. It was round and shiny from the river. She held it up with both hands and placed it on the grass in front of the dragon. The creature sniffed at it, the air hissing through its nostrils. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dragon touched the stone lightly with the tip of its claw. It did not crush it. Instead, it seemed to accept the small gift. Mira smiled. She clapped her hands and laughed again, speaking as though the dragon understood her words. She told it that she liked its wings and that she wanted to play with it. Her voice was small in the wide field, but somehow it carried. The dragon rumbled low in its chest, not in anger, but in something closer to curiosity. Her father ran into the field at last, scooping her up in his arms. His voice shook as he scolded her, but his eyes shone with tears of relief. The dragon did not move against them. It simply spread its wings and rose into the sky, joining the second dragon as they vanished toward the peaks. That night, the council gathered once more. The hall was filled with the noise of voices. Some shouted that the girl must be kept away from the fields for her own safety. Others said perhaps she had been chosen as a bridge between humans and the dragons. A few, braver than the rest, suggested that instead of fearing the beasts, they should try to learn from Mira's example. The arguments lasted until the candles burned low. In the end, the council made no clear decision. Fear still held them tightly, but doubt had begun to crack its grip. Mira, meanwhile, sat by her window. She looked up at the stars, her small hands resting on the sill. She felt no fear. Instead, her heart was full of ideas. If she could give the dragons stones and flowers, perhaps next time she could bring something more. Perhaps she could show them that humans were not enemies. The days that followed were tense. The villagers worked in silence, speaking only in whispers. Children were kept inside, their laughter gone from the streets. At night, people lit fewer lamps, hoping not to draw attention. Yet Mira still dreamed. She drew shapes of dragons in the dirt with sticks. She gathered shiny pebbles from the river and kept them in a small pouch. She planned to share them when she saw the dragons again. One afternoon, while her mother baked bread, Mira slipped away. She walked to the edge of the village and out into the golden fields. The air was calm, but she knew the dragons would come. She waited, sitting cross-legged on the grass, clutching her pouch of treasures. Soon a shadow swept over her. The sound of wings filled the sky. A single dragon descended, the same pale giant with silver eyes she had met before. Mira stood, her heart racing with joy. She opened the pouch and poured her pebbles onto the grass, spreading them out in a little circle. The dragon bent low, sniffing the shiny stones. Its eyes reflected the sunlight, and for a moment Mira thought she saw something like delight in its gaze. The creature placed its claw carefully in the middle of the circle, then lifted it again, leaving a mark in the soil. Mira laughed and clapped her hands. She began to hop around the circle as though it were a game. The dragon watched, its head tilting slowly as it followed her movements. To the villagers hiding in their houses, the sight was terrifying. To Mira, it was beautiful. Her father found her again and rushed to pull her away. But even as he carried her back, he could not ignore what he had seen. The dragon had not harmed her. It had responded. That night he sat with his wife in silence. They watched Mira sleep, her pouch of stones clutched in her small hand. At last he whispered that perhaps the girl was right. Perhaps the dragons were not monsters. His wife said nothing, but her hand tightened around his, and he knew she had seen it too. The colony was changing, though most did not yet admit it. Fear still ruled, but a seed of hope had been planted. Mira's courage, simple and innocent, had opened a door that no council could open with arguments or plans. She was only a child, yet she carried in her heart something stronger than weapons. She carried the courage to believe that even the mightiest of creatures could be friends. And so, under the silent sky of Terran, a new story was beginning, shaped not by fear but by the laughter of a little girl who wanted nothing more than to play. The morning sun rose slowly over the valley of Terran, painting the sky with soft gold and pink colors. The villagers left their homes in silence, their eyes often turning upward. Every day had become a day of waiting. Waiting for the sound of wings, waiting for shadows in the sky, waiting for the fear that came with the albino dragons. Yet the fear was no longer as simple as it once had been. Some villagers now looked at the sky not only with dread but with wonder, for they had seen the way the dragons behaved with Mira. They had seen how the great beast lowered their heads and accepted her presence without harm. And though they tried to bury this thought, a small voice inside each of them whispered that maybe, just maybe, the dragons were not the monsters they once believed. Mira woke early, her small hands clutching the little pouch of pebbles she had gathered. She felt excitement racing through her heart. She did not see the dragons as creatures to be feared. To her, they were friends she had not yet fully met. She wanted to know them, to play with them, and to show the others that there was no need for fear. Her father watched her with worried eyes. He wanted to forbid her from going to the fields again, but each time he looked into her bright face, he could not speak the words. He remembered the dragon's silver eyes and the way it had accepted her small gifts. Something inside him told him that his daughter carried a gift of her own, a gift that could change the colony's fate. That day, the air was still. No wind moved the crops, and the animals were quiet as though they too waited. Then at midday, the shadow came. A single albino dragon glided down from the peaks, its wings stretched wide like sails against the sun. Its cry echoed across the valley, deep and strong, sending shivers through the village. The people froze. Farmers dropped their tools and ran for cover. Mothers pulled their children inside, slamming doors shut. The council members gathered at the edge of the square, their voices rising in alarm. But Mira did not run. She stepped forward, her pouch of treasures in hand, her eyes shining with joy. The dragon descended, its great wings beating like thunder. Dust rose from the ground as it landed in the open field. Its body was vast, covered in pale scales that seemed to catch the sunlight like polished stone. Its eyes, bright as silver fire, fixed on the small girl standing alone. The villagers held their breath. They whispered prayers, waiting for disaster. But Mira stood firm, her small figure calm against the massive shadow. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a smooth river stone. She placed it carefully on the ground, then stepped back. The dragon lowered its head. It sniffed at the stone, its breath rolling out in a misty cloud. The people thought the stone would vanish under a single claw, but instead the dragon touched it lightly, almost carefully, as though it understood the meaning of a gift. Mira smiled and clapped her hands. She picked up a flower from the grass and placed it beside the stone. Then, to the shock of all watching, she walked forward and touched the dragon's pale scales with her hand. Gasps echoed through the village. Some shouted for her to stop, but it was too late. Mira's small palm pressed against the dragon's side, and the creature did not move to harm her. Instead, it rumbled softly, a low sound that vibrated through the ground. The villagers thought it might be a growl, but Mira only laughed. She leaned against the dragon's leg as though leaning against a giant friend. The dragon lifted its head, looking across the village. For a moment, its gaze swept over the houses, the fields, and the people hiding in fear. Yet it did nothing. It spread its wings wide, creating a rush of air that bent the grass. Then it leapt into the sky, rising higher and higher until it was only a white shape against the blue. Mira stood in the field, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes filled with joy. She turned back toward the village and waved. But the people did not wave back. They stood frozen, their minds caught between fear and amazement. That evening, the council met once more. The hall was filled with voices loud and sharp. Some argued that the dragons were too dangerous, that Mira had been lucky and nothing more. Others claimed that the dragons had shown intelligence, that they had accepted Mira's gift as a sign of peace. An old woman spoke softly but firmly. She reminded the council that no weapon they had could harm such creatures. If they chose war, they would lose everything. But if they chose peace, perhaps the dragons could become allies. The council did not reach an answer, but her words stayed in the minds of many. Meanwhile, Mira sat at home, drawing shapes of dragons in the dust on the floor. Her parents watched her quietly, unsure of what to say. At last her father spoke, his voice low. He told his wife that perhaps their daughter was showing them the way forward, that courage could be stronger than fear. In the days that followed, Mira returned to the fields again and again. Each time she brought small gifts, shiny pebbles, wildflowers, or little carvings she had made from wood, and each time the dragon returned. Sometimes one came, sometimes two. They never attacked, never roared in anger. They only watched her, accepted her gifts, and allowed her to sit near them. The villagers began to gather at a distance, watching with wide eyes. Some carried weapons in case of danger, but none were needed. Slowly, whispers spread that Mira had formed a bond with the creatures. One afternoon, a brave farmer stepped closer. He carried a basket of fruit and placed it on the ground a little way behind Mira. The dragon lowered its head and sniffed at the fruit before eating it carefully. The farmer trembled, but when he saw Mira smiling, he felt a strange peace. He returned to the village with hope in his heart. Others followed. A hunter left a bundle of meat, a child placed a handful of berries, and an elder laid down a piece of carved stone. The dragons accepted each gift, never with anger, always with calm. Fear had not yet vanished, but it was no longer the only voice in the hearts of the settlers. Now there was wonder, curiosity, and the first sparks of trust. Mira's courage had opened the door. For the first time since the dragons had appeared, the people of Terran began to believe that these mighty creatures might not be enemies. They began to believe that peace was possible. That night, as the stars filled the silent sky, Mira lay awake. She thought about the dragon's eyes, about the way it had touched her gifts without harm. She thought about how the villagers had begun to step forward, following her lead. She whispered to herself that this was only the beginning. She would keep going, keep playing, keep showing the dragons that humans were not a threat. Far away, in the dark peaks of the mountains, The dragons gathered. Their pale shapes moved among the rocks, their silver eyes glowing in the night. They spoke in deep, rumbling cries that echoed across the cliffs. No human could understand their voices, but one thing was clear. They had noticed the little girl. They had chosen not to harm her, and now they were watching. The first contact between human and dragon had been made, not through war, not through council meetings, but through the laughter of a child who believed in friendship. And though no one yet knew it, this was the moment when everything began to change. The days in Terran began to change slowly, like the turning of a great wheel. Where once the sound of dragon wings had brought nothing but terror, now it brought both fear and hope. People still ran for shelter when the shadows passed, but more and more of them found themselves peeking from doors and windows, curious about what they might see. At the heart of this change was Mira. The little girl no longer waited for the dragons in secret. Her father, though still filled with worry, no longer stopped her. He had seen with his own eyes that the albino dragons treated her differently. He did not understand why, but he could not deny the truth. Each morning, Mira prepared small gifts. She would gather shiny pebbles from the river, wildflowers from the edge of the fields, or small wooden toys she had shaped with her father's carving knife. She placed them in a little cloth bag and carried them proudly. Her mother often knelt and tied the bag for her, her hands trembling but her face calm, as if she too was learning to trust. The dragons came often now. Sometimes one would descend from the peaks, sometimes 2 or 3. They circled the fields before landing, their wings stirring the crops and sending ripples through the grass. Each time Mira ran forward with laughter, unafraid of their size or their glowing eyes. She spread her gifts on the ground and clapped her hands with joy as the dragons bent their long necks to sniff and examine them. At first, the villagers only watched from afar. But soon a few brave souls began to step closer. A farmer brought a basket of ripe fruit. A hunter laid down strips of dried meat. An elder carried a polished stone, smooth and shining, and placed it carefully near Mira's circle of pebbles. The dragons accepted these gifts as well. They did not strike, they did not roar. Instead, they behaved almost gently, lowering their heads and touching the offerings with claws or snouts. The people returned to the village shaken but alive, their fear slowly softening into something new. One afternoon, something even more astonishing happened. Mira stood in the field as usual, her hair blowing in the wind. She laughed and held out her hands, asking the dragons if they wanted to play. One of them lowered its body, spreading its great wings across the grass. Mira stepped forward, her small hand brushing against its scales. To the amazement of everyone watching, the dragon remained still. Slowly, Mira climbed onto its back, gripping the ridges of its neck. Her laughter rang out like bells as the dragon rose, carrying her higher and higher into the sky. The villagers gasped in fear, but they did not see an attack. They saw a bond. The albino dragon did not shake her off or drop her. Instead, it glided gently, circling above the valley with Mira seated proudly on its back. Her laughter floated down to the people below as the dragon soared through the clouds. When it returned, it landed carefully, lowering itself so Mira could slide down to the grass. She ran back toward the village, her cheeks red with joy, her eyes bright as stars. For the first time since the dragons had appeared, the people of Terran cheered. They clapped their hands and shouted with wonder, for they had seen something they could never have imagined. That night the council met again. But the voices were not filled with anger or fear this time. They spoke with hope. Some argued that Mira's bond with the dragons was a gift, a chance for peace between human and beast. Others said it was dangerous to place their future on the shoulders of a child. Yet none could deny what they had seen with their own eyes. The elder woman who had once spoken of peace rose again. She said the dragons had chosen Mira. Through her, the settlers might learn to live beside these mighty creatures rather than against them. Her words spread through the colony like light through darkness. The days that followed were brighter. Children began to play in the streets again, their laughter filling the air. Farmers worked their fields while watching the skies with less fear. The dragons still came, their shadows stretching long across the land, but now people stepped forward instead of hiding. They brought gifts, they spoke softly to the creatures, and some even dared to touch their pale scales. Mira remained at the center of it all. She played with the dragons as if they were her friends. She ran alongside their massive claws, climbed onto their backs, and even sang songs to them in her simple voice. The dragons responded in ways no one could explain. They bent their wings low so she could climb. They rumbled in their chests in sounds that seemed almost like laughter. They never harmed her. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Mira sat beside one of the dragons near the river. She dipped her feet in the cool water while the dragon lowered its head beside her. She spoke softly, telling it about her dreams and her little worries as though it were another child listening. The dragon's silver eyes shone in the fading light, and though it gave no words, it seemed to understand. The villagers watched from a distance, their hearts stirred. They had come to see the truth. The albino dragons were not enemies. They were beings of great power, yes, but also of great patience. They had waited, watching, until someone showed them kindness. And it was Mira, the little girl, who had done what no council, no weapon, no elder could achieve. She had broken the wall of fear. From that day on, the bond between human and dragon grew. The settlers began to build feeding circles at the edge of the fields, leaving food and gifts for the creatures. They no longer rang alarms when wings filled the sky. Instead, they greeted the dragons with cautious respect. Slowly, the beasts began to linger longer, watching the humans as they worked, their eyes no longer filled with distant fire but with curiosity. Mira's father no longer tried to stop her from running to the fields. Instead, he walked beside her, carrying gifts of his own. Her mother came too, her fear replaced by quiet wonder. Families began to follow, each bringing something small to share. Soon the open field became a place where human and dragon stood side by side, no longer as strangers but as neighbors. The change was not complete. Some villagers still feared. Some still whispered that one day the dragons might turn. But fear was no longer the master of Terran. Hope had taken its place. At night, as Mira lay in her bed, she could hear the distant cries of the dragons echoing from the mountains. To her, the cries were not frightening. They were songs, voices calling out in the silent sky. She smiled in her sleep, dreaming of flying once more among the clouds with her new friends. The bond was growing stronger every day. The settlers could feel it in their hearts even if they did not yet understand it fully. Humanity had begun to show what it carried within, a gift no other creature had offered. It was not strength of weapons or power of fire. It was courage, hope, and the simple joy of a little girl who wanted nothing more than to play. And so, under the wide, silent sky of Terran, the story of humans and dragons entered a new chapter. The wall of fear had cracked, and in its place a bridge of trust was rising, built not by councils or armies, but by the laughter of one child and the patience of mighty creatures who had chosen to listen. The sun rose gently over the mountains of Terran, washing the valley in soft golden light. The colony was no longer silent and fearful like it had been in the past. Instead of hiding indoors, people walked outside with open faces. The once quiet fields were alive with movement. Farmers were tending to the crops. Children were playing in the grass, and the air carried a new sound that none had imagined would ever exist in this world. The sound of dragons flying not as hunters of fear, but as companions of peace. The albino dragons, with their pale wings shining like silver clouds, soared above the village. Their shadows passed across the fields, but no one hid anymore. Instead, people paused to watch them with admiration. The dragons, once thought of as creatures of terror, now lowered their wings in greetings. The connection had grown so deep that they would land near the colony without hesitation. At the center of it all was Mira. She was still small, still playful, and still carried the same spirit that had first brought her close to the dragons. But now she was no longer just the curious child of the colony. She had become a symbol of something greater. To the colonists, she represented courage. To the dragons, she was the first to see them not as monsters, but as friends. Mira's bond with the albino dragons had grown stronger with each passing day. She would run into the fields in the morning and call out with laughter, and the dragons would respond with mighty cries that echoed through the valley. She climbed onto their backs, her hands clutching their smooth scales, and they carried her into the sky with great care. The villagers who once shook in terror now watched with awe. The council of elders who had once argued only about defense and survival now sat together in new discussions. They spoke of cooperation with the dragons. They spoke of protection for the colony that no wall or weapon could ever match. They began to see that what Mira had done was not just a miracle for their small settlement, but a lesson for all of humanity. News of the change did not stay within the colony for long. Travelers from nearby settlements came after hearing strange rumors. They expected to see ruins or frightened people hiding underground. Instead, they saw children chasing dragons in the fields and farmers working, while dragons circled overhead like guardians. What they saw challenged everything they believed. Some were afraid at first, but when they saw Mira walk confidently among the dragons, their fear softened. They watched her pat the muzzle of a creature that could crush her with one movement, and they saw how gently it lowered its head to meet her. They saw her laugh as she held up flowers for the dragons, and they saw how the dragons treated her with trust. The visitors carried this story back to their own people. Soon, explorers and leaders from other colonies came. They wanted to see if it was true that humans had befriended the most feared creatures of the skies. Each time they arrived, they were greeted not by tales but by the sight itself. The albino dragons no longer soared alone. They flew alongside humans and they landed peacefully in villages. For Mira, it was never about pride or power. She only wanted to play. She had never thought of herself as a leader or hero. She simply saw beauty where others saw danger. But unknowingly, she had given a gift that reached far beyond her small world. She had given humanity a new way of thinking. The bond between humans and dragons grew deeper as seasons passed. The colony learned that the dragons were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent and carried their own sense of honor. They guarded the valley from storms by flying in protective patterns above the fields. They chased away predators that once threatened livestock. They even learned to respond to human signals. A call from a horn would bring dragons to the skies, circling in watchful formation. This unity brought peace not only to Terran but to all the neighboring lands. Conflicts between settlements lessened because people were inspired by the example of Mira and her dragons. Leaders realized that if a small child could turn fear into friendship, then perhaps humanity itself could change its path from suspicion and conflict to cooperation and trust. One day, a great council was held in the main square of Terran. Representatives from many colonies came, and they stood in the shadow of the albino dragons who perched calmly on the nearby cliffs. The people spoke of unity, of a new alliance not only among humans but between humans and dragons. They decided to call it the Pact of the Skies. Mira was brought forward to stand before the gathering. She was still only a child, but when she looked at the sea of faces, she did not tremble. She simply smiled as she always did. The dragons behind her lowered their wings in respect. It was clear to everyone that this small girl had done what no warrior or council had ever been able to do. An elder spoke to the crowd. He said that humanity had always been known for fear of the unknown, for building walls against what they could not understand. But now, through the innocence of one child, they had learned that trust could open doors fear would never unlock. He said that this was not only a victory for the colony, but a reminder of what humanity could become across the stars. The people cheered, and the dragons gave a mighty cry that shook the ground. The Pact of the Skies was signed that day, not with weapons but with promises. Humans promised to honor the dragons, and the dragons promised to guard the skies of the colonies. It was a bond built not out of force but out of trust. Mira's life changed after that, but in her heart she remained the same playful child. She still woke up eager to run to the fields. She still carried flowers to the dragons. She still laughed when they lowered their great heads for her to pat. But now she was not alone. Other children joined her. Other families walked beside the dragons. The bond that began with one small girl spread to many, and it became a way of life. Years passed, and the story of Mira and the albino dragons traveled far across the galaxy. When explorers from distant human worlds heard of it, they came to see for themselves. They too carried the tale back to their own people. In time, even alien civilizations who had once seen humanity as small and fragile began to hear the story. They wondered how such a young race could do what they themselves had not achieved. It was not strength of weapons or power of armies that brought the dragons to peace. It was the courage of a child, the innocence to look past fear, and the hope to reach out a hand instead of hiding. Humanity, through Mira, had shown that it carried something rare, not just intelligence or ambition, but a heart that could see the world differently. And so, on the world of Terran, the skies that once carried only fear became skies of laughter and hope. The albino dragons still soared high above the mountains, their pale wings catching the light of the sun, but now they carried riders on their backs. They carried children into the air. They carried the trust of a people who had once thought of them only as monsters. In the end, Mira's story was remembered not just as the tale of a girl and dragons. It was remembered as the moment when humanity discovered its greatest strength, the ability to turn fear into friendship, to turn silence into song, and to turn danger into guardianship. Generations later, as colonies grew and stars were reached, Mira's name was still spoken with honor. The Pact of the Skies remained strong, and the albino dragons continued to fly with humans. What began with one little girl who wanted to play became a legacy that shaped not just one world but the future of many. The story of the albino dragons and the child of Terran became proof to all that no matter how vast the universe or how great the fear, humanity could always find a way to bring light through hope. And so, in the valley of Terran, where the morning sun rose over fields of peace, Mira ran laughing with her dragon friends, her voice carried high into the skies, a melody of trust that would echo for centuries.